October 15th, 539 BCE. The great city of Babylon burns above while below, in forgotten chambers, Persian soldiers make a discovery that will haunt them forever. The treasure hunters descended into darkness, their torches casting dancing shadows on ancient stone. They had come seeking gold, seeking the legendary wealth of Babylon's priests. What they found instead would test the limits of human sanity. "Captain, over here!" The youngest soldier's voice cracked with terror. His spade had struck something in what appeared to be a refuse pit, broken pottery, rotted wood, the detritus of a fallen empire. But beneath the rubble lay something that made these battle-hardened warriors step back in horror. Small bones, too small to be anything but a child's. The skeleton was unmistakably that of a young boy, twisted into impossible angles, surrounded by clay tablets scattered like autumn leaves. The captain lifted one with trembling hands, his knowledge of cuneiform barely adequate to decipher the crude, hastily carved message. "He sleeps beneath. Do not wake what lies below." Another tablet. "The 13th moon brings his return." And another. "We should have let him rest." What had the priests of Babylon tried so desperately to hide? What terror was so great that they buried it in secret, surrounding it with warnings that time itself could not erase? The answer lay 13 years in the past, with a boy who wanted nothing more than to make his mother proud. 13 years earlier. His name was Enlil Nabu, and he was 12 years old when they came for him. In the courtyard of his family's modest home near the Euphrates, birds had been singing that morning. By noon, even the sparrows had fallen silent, as if nature itself sensed what was approaching. Enlil was helping his younger sister grind barley when the temple delegation arrived. 3 priests in pristine white robes, 2 temple guards with bronze spears, and behind them, the selector, a woman whose eyes had witnessed too many boys taken, too many mothers destroyed by grief. "We seek the one blessed by heaven," she announced, though everyone knew what those words truly meant. Virgin boys, pure and untouched by the world's corruption. The temple had uses for such children, purposes that were never discussed in daylight. His mother appeared in the doorway, and color drained from her face like water from a broken vessel. She had heard the whispers in the marketplace, the rumors that traveled on women's tongues late at night. Boys chosen for the temple's inner mysteries never returned home. "Not my son," she whispered, then louder, with growing desperation. "Please, not my son." The selector moved through their small house like a hunting cat, examining each child with practiced eyes. She passed over his sister, too young. His older brother, recently married and therefore impure, was ignored completely. Then her gaze fell upon Enlil Nabu. "This one," she said simply. What followed was chaos born of a mother's love and a father's helplessness. His mother threw herself between them, offering everything they owned, everything they could ever hope to possess. His father tried reason, then bribes, then desperate threats that meant nothing against the temple's absolute authority. "You should feel honored," the head priest said, though his voice carried no warmth. "Your son will serve the gods themselves." As strong hands pulled him away, Enlil Nabu heard his mother's scream, a sound of pure anguish that would echo in his mind through every horror to come. It was the last sound of love he would ever hear. They dressed his fate in beautiful words, chosen, blessed, sacred duty. But as they marched him through Babylon's crowded streets, citizens averted their eyes. Everyone knew the truth that none dared speak aloud. The temple complex rose before them like a mountain of fired brick and broken dreams. Enlil had been here before during public festivals, but they approached a different entrance now. Smaller, darker, guarded by men who wore no identifying marks. This was the door that swallowed boys and never gave them back. The smell struck him first as they passed through the threshold. Frankincense so thick it choked the air, mixed with something else, something that smelled like fear itself made manifest. The passage beyond was narrow, lit by oil lamps that threw writhing shadows on walls covered in prayers written in scripts too ancient for him to read. "Wait here," the selector commanded, leaving him in a small chamber where the walls seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. That's when he heard them. Voices, young voices, chanting the same words over and over in a language that predated even ancient Sumerian. The sound made his skin crawl with primal dread. A door opened and another boy appeared, perhaps 14 years old, but his eyes held the weight of decades. His head was shaved, his thin body draped in a rough brown robe that couldn't hide how drastically he'd wasted away. "New one?" the boy asked, his voice hoarse like he'd been screaming for days. When Enlil nodded, unable to find words, the boy continued, I was called Marduk Shapik once. They don't encourage names here. Come, they'll want you cleaned first." As they walked through corridors that seemed to descend forever into the earth, Marduk Shapik whispered urgently, "Forget everything you were before. None of it matters now. The only thing that matters is surviving what comes next." They passed chambers where other boys sat in absolute silence, staring at walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. One boy rocked back and forth, clutching something invisible to his chest. Another traced patterns in the air with trembling fingers, as if writing messages that only he could see. "Don't stare," Marduk Shapik warned, "and whatever you do, don't ask about the ones who aren't here anymore." They took his identity first. In the purification chamber, they stripped him of his clothes and burned them while he watched. They shaved every hair from his body, then bathed him in water that reeked of lotus and something metallic old blood. He realized with growing horror, mixed with sacred oils. "You are not Enlil Nabu," the masked priest intoned. "You are a vessel, empty, waiting to be filled with divine purpose." The systematic destruction of self began immediately. Hours of chanting in the ancient tongue followed, the words hypnotic and designed to erode the mind's defenses. Some boys chanted along perfectly, their voices empty of emotion or thought. Others struggled to keep up, their humanity fighting against the process. One boy in the corner didn't chant at all. He just smiled at something only he could see. They tied a red cord around his waist, cinching it tight enough to leave permanent marks. "This binds you to your purpose," the priest explained. "Remove it, and the gods will know immediately. The punishment for such sacrilege is creative." Sleep became impossible. They were kept moving constantly. Prayers, purifications, lessons in the forbidden tongue, more prayers. When exhaustion threatened to claim them, the priests had methods to maintain consciousness. Cold water, beaten drums, sharp reeds across bare shoulders. 6 days without rest, and reality began to fracture. Enlil watched stone walls ripple like water, saw faces in the shadows that whispered secrets in languages dead since before Babylon's founding. One boy, he'd said his name was Nobushalem before they took it, began laughing during evening prayers, not with joy, but with the broken sound of a mind finally shattering completely. He laughed until blood ran from his nose, until his voice gave out, until the priests dragged him away. When morning came, there were only 7 boys left. Where did he go? Enlil dared to ask. The priest's bronze mask turned toward him slowly. Who? The boy who was laughing. There were 8 of us. Now there are 7. There are 7 vessels. There have always been 7 vessels. But Enlil remembered. Even as exhaustion devoured his thoughts, he clung to that memory like a lifeline. 8 boys. Then 7. How many more would simply disappear? On the 13th night, they opened the door that required 3 different keys held by 3 different priests. As it swung inward, a wave of cold air escaped carrying scents that made Enlil's primitive brain scream warnings. lotus, myrrh, copper, and underneath it all, the sweet sick smell of death. The 7 remaining boys were led inside in single file, heads bowed as they'd been trained. What Enlil glimpsed in his peripheral vision made him grateful for the prohibition against looking directly at their surroundings. The chamber was circular, carved from a single piece of black stone that didn't match any rock found near Babylon. The walls curved upward into darkness, covered in symbols that predated cuneiform and seemed to writhe when observed directly. Bronze instruments hung from the walls, hooks, blades, restraints, all inscribed with prayers, all bearing the dark stains of use. But it was the pit in the center that drew the eye, 8 feet across, lined with the same black stone, descending into darkness so complete it seemed solid. The air above it shimmered like heat waves, though the chamber was cold enough to see their breath. "Behold," the high priest announced from behind his elaborate mask, a chimera of bird and beast and something else entirely. "The mouth of Tiamat, the gateway, the hunger that waits." The screams from below proved someone had already begun the process. Not human screams. The sound was wrong, filtered through a throat that had been changed, modified, made suitable for producing frequencies that human vocal cords should never achieve. Then the priests began explaining what the boys had truly been prepared for, not in comforting metaphors or religious allegory, but in brutal, practical detail. "Every 13 moons, the gateway weakens," the high priest said. "What sleeps below stirs, reaching upward, seeking passage into our world. It must be fed, not common blood, for it has no taste for the corrupt. Only the pure will satisfy. Only virgin boys, prepared correctly, can hold its attention long enough for the binding rituals to complete their work." That's when Enlil understood what the red cord really meant. Not just a mark of their status, but a leash, a way to lower them down when their time came. The transformation began subtly. Boys waking with unexplained bruises, finding their hair falling out in clumps, tasting copper constantly no matter what they ate or drank. Then it accelerated beyond anything that should have been possible. One boy began speaking in tongues during morning prayers, not the ancient language they'd been taught, but something older, more fundamental. The sounds he made weren't meant for human throats. By evening, his voice had changed completely, dropping 3 octaves and carrying harmonics that made the bronze instruments ring in sympathy. Another developed a taste for the lotus petals the priests provided, not eating them exactly, but sucking them dry, drawing out essences that shouldn't have existed. The priests supplied them willingly, noting his consumption in their tablets with obvious satisfaction. "The gateway recognizes its offerings," one priest observed. "It prepares them according to its needs." A third boy grew scales, not all at once, but gradually. First just a patch on his shoulder that looked like dry skin. Then it spread, each scale perfect and iridescent like a river fish. He spent hours clawing at them until his fingers bled, but they always grew back by morning, larger and more pronounced. The cruelest fate belonged to the boy who simply stopped. One morning he sat down and ceased all voluntary movement. He breathed, his heart beat. He would swallow if food was placed in his mouth, but his consciousness had retreated so far inside that nothing could reach it. The priests were delighted. Perfect emptiness, they called it. A vessel truly voided of self. They positioned him like a doll during rituals, and he remained however they placed him, hours later still in the exact same position, not even blinking. Still alive, still aware on some level. Tears would sometimes roll down his face, but no longer present in any meaningful way. For Enlil, the changes began with pain in his spine, subtle at first, like his bones were trying to remember a different shape. He woke one morning to find his body betraying him in ways that defied understanding. The human form, it seemed, was merely a suggestion when forces beyond the gateway took interest. Enlil's spine had developed a curve overnight, not the gentle arch of poor posture, but sharp angles that made lying flat impossible. "Magnificent!" the attending priest murmured, running fingers along the protruding vertebrae. "The cuneiform of heaven, writing itself upon your bones." Each morning brought new horrors. What began as discomfort became agony as his skeleton rearranged itself according to patterns that served purposes human anatomy never intended. When he tried to stand straight, lightning shot through his nervous system. When he hunched forward, accepting the deformity, the pain eased to merely unbearable. His legs were next. The strength drained from them over 3 days, muscles withering despite being forced to walk endless circuits of the ritual chamber. First he needed to lean on walls, then he crawled, then even that became impossible. "Roots," one priest noted, making marks on a clay tablet. "He grows roots for the descent." The dietary changes were perhaps most disturbing. Normal food became ash in their mouths. Water tasted of sulfur and decay. But the lotus petals the priests provided, soaked in oils from the sacred pit, these they craved with desperate hunger. Each petal consumed accelerated the transformations, bringing them closer to their final forms. "You're ripening," the high priest observed during evening inspection, examining Enlil's spine now twisted into shapes that resembled the sacred symbols on the chamber walls. "Like fruit for the harvest, sweet suffering to attract what hungers below." Outside the temple, all of Babylon prepared to celebrate renewal. Inside, 7 boys prepared to die, or perhaps to discover there were fates far worse than death. The irony wasn't lost on Enlil, even as his mind frayed at the edges. Above, citizens hung flower garlands and prepared feast tables for Akitu, the New Year festival celebrating Marduk's victory over chaos. Below, in chambers that officially didn't exist, they were being prepared as offerings to ensure chaos remained fed and sleeping. The drums started at dawn, their rhythm carrying through stone and earth to reach even the deepest chambers. Each beat seemed to accelerate the transformations. Enlil's spine cracked and reformed with the percussion, adding new angles that turned his torso into a living glyph of summoning. The visions began 3 days before the festival proper. Enlil would blink and see things that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps had happened so many times they'd worn grooves in reality itself. He saw himself suspended over the pit, copper wires threading through his transformed flesh. He saw his mouth opening to speak words that would crack the sky. He saw what would rise to meet him, and his mind tried to retreat from the knowledge. But worse were the visions of the past. In fevered dreams, he walked through the memories of boys who'd come before. 13 years of festivals, 13 years of offerings, and he experienced each one as if it were happening to him personally. "He sees too much," one priest muttered. "The gateway is already claiming him." "Good," the high priest responded. "The deeper the connection before the ritual, the stronger the binding afterward." 3 days before the scheduled festival, something went catastrophically wrong. The boy with impossible joints had been prepared for his descent first. The priests had wound him in the ritual configurations, spoken the preliminary words, begun lowering him toward whatever waited in the depths. But halfway down, he began to laugh. Not the broken sound of madness they'd heard before, but genuine mirth, as if he'd understood some cosmic joke that had eluded everyone else. His laughter echoed up from the pit, building upon itself, and with each peal, cracks appeared in the chamber's black stone. "Pull him up," the high priest commanded, but it was too late. The boy's laughter had become something else, a frequency that resonated with the gateway itself. The pit began to breathe, its exhalations carrying hints of spaces between stars, and from below, something laughed back. They lost 6 priests that night. Not to death. Death would have been merciful. They lost them to revelation, to understanding too much too quickly. By morning, those 6 were speaking in perfect unison, their individual personalities erased by whatever truth they'd glimpsed in those moments of connection. The festival would have to be accelerated. The gateway was growing unstable, hungry, impatient. The careful 13-moon cycle had been disrupted by the boy's laughter, by the accumulated weight of years of secrets and sacrifices. Tomorrow, the high priest decided, his mask unable to hide the fear in his voice. Ready or not, we complete the ritual tomorrow. But Enlil's body was failing. The transformations had progressed too rapidly, pushed beyond what even their ancient knowledge could control. His breathing became labored, his twisted spine unbending as muscles finally gave up their unnatural positions. No, no, no! The high priest tore off his mask, revealing a face scarred by proximity to the gateway. We need him alive for the binding. They tried everything. Sacred oils poured down his throat, lotus petals forced between his lips, even copper wires meant to conduct ritual energies. Nothing worked. His body had decided to surrender before the ritual could claim it properly. His last breath came just as the sacred words were being spoken. The silence that followed Enlil's death was deafening. Then came the sound from below, not the eager stirring they expected, but something like disappointment, like a predator realizing its prey had died of fear before the hunt could truly begin. The ritual required a living conduit. The gateway had been opened, the hunger called forth, but without a living vessel to channel through and bind it, disaster was inevitable. The pit began to vomit darkness. Not shadow, but actual darkness. A substance that devoured light, that made air solid, that carried whispers in languages that predated human speech. It rose like floodwater, and where it touched the bronze instruments, they aged 1,000 years in seconds. "Seal it!" someone screamed. "Seal the gateway!" But the ritual had its own momentum now. 13 years of sacrifices had worn the boundaries thin. 13 festivals of feeding had taught the thing below to expect its meal. And now, cheated of its proper offering, it was coming to collect in person. The high priest grabbed Enlil's corpse, trying desperately to revive it. He pressed on the still chest, breathed into dead lungs, even tried cutting patterns that might restart a stopped heart. Nothing. The boy was gone, and with him any hope of completing the binding. They had 4 hours before dawn to hide what had happened. 4 hours before festival-goers above would expect to hear the ritual bells announcing another successful renewal, another year of prosperity bought with innocent blood. The darkness had filled half the chamber now, and things moved within it. Not quite shapes, more like suggestions of anatomy that shouldn't exist. The younger priests fled, abandoning their posts. The senior ones tried to maintain the chanting, but fear made them stumble over syllables, and each mistake made the situation worse. The high priest made a decision born of pure desperation. If they couldn't complete the ritual, they could at least contain the evidence. "Burn everything," he commanded in the administrative tongue. "Every scroll, every instrument, every record this ritual ever existed. Collapse the lower chambers. Seal every entrance with molten lead. And the body," he looked at Enlil's twisted form, "bury it where no one will ever think to look." As they worked through the night, none noticed the servant girl watching from the shadows, or the clay tablet she clutched in her hands. She'd been bringing water to the priests, one of dozens of temple servants whose existence barely registered to their masters. But she'd heard the screams over the years. She'd seen boys go down into the dark and never return. And tonight she'd witnessed the final failure of a system built on innocent suffering. The tablet in her hands bore a simple message, carved with a kitchen knife in clumsy cuneiform. Below the temple where they burned the broken gods, a boy died to save us all. His name was Enlil Nabu. Remember him. By dawn, it was as if the ritual chambers had never existed. The official story was already being crafted. A minor fire in storage areas, quickly contained, no cause for alarm. The festival would continue as planned. But the gateway, cheated of its meal and robbed of its proper binding, didn't close completely. In the space between spaces where the ritual had torn reality, something continued to seep through. The darkness they'd released wouldn't stay contained forever. What began as subtle sounds in the temple quickly spread throughout Babylon like a plague of whispers. Servants in the palace reported walls that sighed. Merchants in the market heard sobbing from beneath their feet. Children woke screaming about boys with twisted spines crawling through their dreams. The priests tried to maintain order, but how could they explain what they didn't understand themselves? The failed ritual had torn something fundamental in the spiritual fabric of the city. Within a week, transformations began manifesting in the general population. A baker woke to find his hands fused together in permanent prayer position. A scribe discovered his spine curving into the same cuneiform shapes that had marked Enlil. Children in the temple school began speaking the ancient tongue without being taught, their young voices harmonizing in frequencies that cracked glass. Even the king's food began to rot when blessed by the tainted priests. The royal kitchen reported meat turning green with luminescent mold, wine becoming blood, bread sprouting fungal growths that pulsed like heartbeats. "What have you done?" the king demanded of the high priest. "What sin stains my city?" But the priests couldn't confess without revealing 13 years of hidden atrocities. They spoke of mysterious portents, of divine tests, of anything but the truth, that they'd built their power on the suffering of innocents, and now the bill had come due. The servant girl moved through the chaos like a ghost, documenting everything on her growing collection of tablets. She'd found hiding spots throughout the temple complex, forgotten spaces where she could work undisturbed. Tablet after tablet, she carved the truth. The priests burn their records, but fire cannot consume truth. 7 boys entered the sacred chamber. 1 remains below, still screaming. The gateway stays hungry. The binding failed. He is beneath. That last phrase became her refrain, carved onto dozens of tablets that she scattered throughout the temple. Some she hid in the walls, others she buried near the refuse pit. A few she slipped into official archives, hidden among mundane inventory lists where they might survive unnoticed. Her final tablet was different, longer, more detailed, hidden in a pottery jar and buried directly above Enlil's grave. Here lies a boy who saved Babylon by failing to die properly. The priests sought to feed the darkness with his suffering. Instead, his death at the wrong moment broke their ritual and released what they'd kept bound. The city will fall because of this night. The empire will crumble, but no more boys will die in the chambers below. His name was Enlil Nabu, son of Marduk-Balotsu, brother to little Ishtar who carved wooden birds. Remember him not as victim, but as the key that locked the gateway by breaking in the lock. When Babylon falls, know it was his freedom that killed it. He is beneath. He is at peace. He is avenged. The Persians were at the gates now, and still the breathing in the walls continued. Cyrus's armies surrounded the city, but its defenders were fighting battles within as well. Soldiers reported weapons that whispered discouragement, walls that bled when struck, gates that opened themselves in the night as if inviting conquest. And so we return to where we began, Persian soldiers in 539 BCE, uncovering the truth that Babylon's priests had tried so desperately to hide. The servant girl's tablets told a complete story. 13 years of systematic horror disguised as religious necessity, ended finally by one boy's refusal to die at the appointed time. The pattern feels sickeningly familiar across history. Institutions claiming divine authority, vulnerable children selected for special honor, systematic abuse disguised as ritual necessity, layers of secrecy ensuring silence. And when it all collapses, frantic attempts to destroy evidence and deny everything. But truth has a way of surviving, carved in clay by those who witnessed it. hidden where time will eventually find it. The Persian Empire that replaced Babylon learned from these discoveries. The dark chambers stayed sealed. The gateway remained closed. No more boys were transformed into conduits for forces beyond human understanding. Yet the lessons echo across millennia. How power corrupts the sacred, how institutions protect themselves over innocence, how systematic abuse hides behind religious authority, how the vulnerable are silenced while their abusers claim divine mandate. Some say if you listen carefully in the ruins of ancient Babylon, you can still hear breathing beneath the stones. But perhaps what echoes there isn't waiting, it's warning. A reminder that whenever power goes unchecked, whenever authority shields itself from accountability, whenever the suffering of innocence is deemed acceptable for a greater good, we risk creating our own gateways to darkness. The servant girl who documented these horrors couldn't save Enlil Nabu. She couldn't stop the ritual or prevent future selections. But she could ensure their story survived, scratched into clay and hidden where time would find it. In the end, that's all any of us can do when faced with institutional evil. Document, preserve, and ensure the voices of the silenced echo through history. Not for sensation, not for entertainment, but as warning, as witness, as promise to the vulnerable that their suffering, while hidden, will never be forgotten. He is beneath, but his story rises. And in that rising, perhaps we find not just horror, but hope, the knowledge that truth, however deeply buried, eventually claws its way back to light. The darkness that consumed Babylon serves as eternal warning. When we allow power to operate in shadow, when we permit the sacred to become shield for the profane, when we sacrifice the innocent on altars of necessity, we don't feed the gods, we feed the very demons we claim to hold at bay. Remember Enlil Nabu. Remember them all. And in remembering, ensure such darkness never finds fertile ground again.